Hello, puppies and kittens. Welcome to another interview for me with an author, and this is an author of Broken Promises. And I'm sorry that I didn't get a chance to read the book myself, but I normally would. And that's the greatest advantage of doing interviews with authors, that I get to read books, and they've always been good. I'm sorry that I couldn't read yours. I saw by the cover that you've got a number of references to things that Jesus said in the Bible, and so let's expand on that. What are these broken promises?
Okay. When I was a Christian for 20 plus years, very dedicated, gave my life to the Lord, etc., etc. I knew that there were promises that Jesus made that he would return, in glory, judgment day, and all that. But I never really pursued them all that much. Well, later on, when I actually did my long-term study on the second coming, I was surprised to find out that some theologians think up to half of the New Testament is eschatological. And when I dug into it,
the key word there being scat, I think.
Good point. The whole thrust of the Gospels is Jesus bringing in this new kingdom that's going to take over the world, and peace and righteousness will, flow from the mountains, etc., etc. They were expecting that. They weren't scared of the Romans. They weren't scared of death. They fully expected the Messiah to set up this new kingdom on earth, Jesus' second coming. And he made it, according to the Gospels, he made several very specific promises about this second coming of his and when it would take place. I like to call it expiration dates. When you have a carton of milk, it expires after a certain time. Well, these promises came with expiration dates, which have long since passed. The primary expiration date being within the generation of the people he physically spoke to. And do you address
the apologists who try to make up excuses to counter that when he said, that some of you here standing will still be alive when I return, or words to that effect? I mean, that they say, well, he didn't really mean this. And they always talk about prophetic language, how the same sentence can mean something two different ways, but not be literally true. So if if you take this word and pretend that this word means that and that word means this other thing, then you can make everything, make anything say whatever the hell you want it to. So how do you address that one?
Well, it's been interesting to me that they will take supposed prophecies about Jesus from the Old Testament at face value and never quibble them.
I don't think Jews are aware of any.
No, they're not. They're not. The people that actually know the Old Testament know better. But I do take these Christian quibbles and deal with them. What surprised me in doing my study is to find out there's maybe almost a dozen different conflicting explanations of what Jesus really meant in all these second coming prophecies. And the bottom line is, I went ahead and put a whole chapter of this in my book. I call it Christian Dishonesty. That was another surprise to me as a Christian doing this study. But any explanation other than the obvious one is acceptable. And I think the actual goal for a lot of these theologians is to just make the average Christian throw up his hands, give up and say, this is beyond my pay grade, I can't understand this, and walk away. They don't want the Christian to think these things through. So the explanation doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be right. It doesn't have to be logical. As long as it confuses the sheep and the sheep go back to their pews and sit down and shut up. I got a whole chapter on just the dishonesty of Christians and theologians throughout history. As far as there's
I want to
specific,
can we visit that just for a moment, because you said that you were a believer
yes.
when you were doing the research that ultimately ended up in this book. And I've told people before that there was a poll done at American Atheist National Convention once upon a time, an informal poll, but they were asking all these people, most of whom were raised Christian, and they asked what was the catalyst that got you to lose your faith, and the answer that scientific explanations was tertiary, and the hypocrisy of the church was the second most popular answer.
Mm-hmm.
But the number one most common answer was they read the Bible.
Bingo.
Yeah.
This journey of mine started back when I was in my mid-teens at a Church of Christ Sunday school class. We were on the 24th chapter of Matthew. Matthew 24:34, Jesus says that he will return within that generation. That confused me. So when I got into Sunday school that day for the class, I asked the teacher, it seems like Jesus is promising his second coming within the lifetime of the people 33 AD, whatever. And he did the standard cop out. Well, that's a great question. I'll get back to you later. He never did. Anyway, it took me 20 years after that for me to finally get back to that question. That's when I started my study. And I spent 6 months of very intensive research specifically on that topic. And I've researched it since that study, obviously. But in 6 months, all the evidence ended up on the side of the column indicating Jesus had been a false prophet. Every explanation that had been put forth by theologians, every excuse, etc., eventually fell to the wayside. And it was really surprising to me when I finally got to the end that the evidence to me was overwhelming. And I made up my mind then and there, even if Jesus was the Son of God, even if he walked on water, even if he rose from the dead, he was a false prophet. That is beyond dispute. And I refused to worship a false prophet. And eventually led me to atheism.
My take on that was vaguely similar. I mean, when I was reading the Bible, I was told that it's the Word of God, and that God is God is love, and then if I read the Bible, I'm going to tap into infinite, superior wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you don't get very far into the Bible before you realize that it was written by very inferior beings who obviously had no idea what they were talking about.
Which franchise were you?
I don't know that it matters. I was raised in a Mormon family. I was baptized Mormon. I never identified as Mormon. And I don't even know what version of the Bible I tried to go through. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I probably was the King James, but I really can't tell. The thing is that I still believed in God at that time, and I thought that the character that they're portraying God to be is absolutely reprehensible. It's a stupid being. It's an insecure being. It's a narcissist. It's got everything wrong with it. And so I offered a prayer asking God to explain himself, either to justify all of these atrocities that he's being accused of in the Bible, or explain how the Bible got him wrong. And that I would say that prayer had been answered, because for the rest of my life, all I ever saw was evidence that the Bible got everything wrong.
It tends to go that way.
Yeah, so I wanted to hear a little bit more about what was the breakdown in your deconversion?
Okay,
because you mentioned that it was Christian dishonesty, and I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, what was the final straw for me was through intensive research, discovering that Jesus had been a false prophet. In the Old Testament, being a false prophet would get one stoned to death. So that's what forced me to walk away from Christianity. I cannot worship a false prophet, bottom line. Getting back to some of the standard cop-outs that theologians have come up with for several of the Jesus prophetic promises. Matthew 16 has Jesus basically saying, there are some of those standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his power, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things I did in my book, I'm going at it strictly as a fundamentalist Christian would. I'm quoting mostly the Bible, and I'm also quoting mostly Christian theologians. I'm not quoting so much that many wild-eyed atheists, et cetera, et cetera. I want Christians to read this book and come to their own conclusions. And many Christian theologians admit that these promises of Jesus are a problem. They don't necessarily have an explanation for them. There's got to be one, but I don't know what it is, that sort of thing. Those are the honest ones. Some of the dishonest ones, again, they'll scrounge around and bring up anything just as long as it confuses the issue. On the Matthew 16 reference, the most favorite one is they split that little verse up into two parts, saying, well, this part was meant for then and that part was meant for later. And when you ask them, where's the evidence for the split, they don't have any. Or some have even said, well, when Jesus promised that they would see him come in glory, the very next chapter has the transfiguration. That was the fulfillment of this promise. The problem is Jesus also promised Judgment Day along with his second coming, which obviously did not happen during the transfiguration. And there's a few other goofball explanations that are explained. Another big prophecy is the entire 24th chapter of Matthew, which culminates in Matthew 24:34, which I had one preacher tell me one time, that's all you ever talk about. So I said, okay, let's have a discussion. I won't even bring it up. We don't need to bring up Matthew 24:34. But that is a very important explanation. And one of the things I did in my
fill us in, because people are not going to be familiar with that verse, and they don't know the explanation you're talking about. So,
yeah. This is from the New American Standard Bible. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And he was speaking supposedly around 33 AD, give or take, talking to that generation, that all the things he had just mentioned previously in the chapter would take place within their lifetime. We're talking about Judgment Day, the angels gathering up the saints from around the world, stars falling to the earth, great disasters, etc., etc. The whole 24th chapter of Matthew had an expiration date of one generation from 33 AD. In the Bible, a generation is considered to be around 40 years. So 40 years past 33 AD, that prophecy expired, and definitely 2,000 years later, it's gone and buried. Yeah. One of the things I've done in my book, I'll just do a quick show here. I got over 90 translations of Matthew 24:34, because that was another thing that Christians were quibbling with. Well, that's just the translation's bad. Well, I got 90 translations by Christian theologians that back up what I'm saying. And then I get into a bunch of theologians explaining the word Genea, from which we get generation. That was another quibbling point. Well, Genea doesn't mean generation in that one verse. Everywhere else it does, but not that one verse. In this verse, it means race. It means people alive at the time Jesus comes. And it goes on for several other goofball explanations. I deal with those, primarily quoting other Christian theologians, showing the error in that thinking. And so that's a big section of the book, and that's worth the price right there, if nothing else.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I approached this also in my book, and it's a fun discussion. I mean, the fact that Jesus says some of you, will, as opposed to all, if you by specifying only some of them will not taste death, that negates a common apologetic where, well, they were told they were only dead in the body. They weren't. No, only some of them. So what are you going to do with only some?
Well, being a former sort of Mormon, I think the Mormons came up with the best explanation of this. They mention towards the end of the book of John, it hints around that the Apostle John might not ever die. And the Mormons say, well, John's still alive, so that prophecy, hasn't expired yet. A very creative one. How are you going to prove that the Apostle John died? Good luck.
Yeah. I mean, we could just go with common understanding that if I'm leaving the house and I say that I'll return very soon.
Yes.
That it'll probably be within the next 1900 years.
Yeah. That's another point I get into at the very beginning of the book. I go into the key words, again, Christian theologians and Christian reference books to define them, such as the Greek word milo, which is usually translated soon, the Greek word engizo, and a few other ones. I give the full explanation of those to get those out of the way because, again, there are some dishonest Christian Bible translations that deliberately mistranslate those keywords in certain verses that would otherwise tend to indicate that Jesus was a false prophet. They don't do it elsewhere, but just in those parts.
You mean just key places? A word like maiden would become virgin?
How'd you know? Similar. Yeah. Another big verse to me, I believe it's in Matthew 26, where Jesus is promising Caiaphas that Caiaphas would live to see the second coming. It would be within his lifetime. You shall see the Son of Man, coming from on high, etc., etc. I was excited when Biblical Archaeology Review, I think it was in the early 90s, had a cover story. They had discovered the tomb of Caiaphas. So that explanation that the Mormons use about John could not be used about Caiaphas. We actually have physical proof that Caiaphas died, and Jesus did not return within his lifetime. So that was another good one.
Tell me some of these other, because the cover of your book has a whole bunch of things. I mean, obviously not just this one or associated prophecies. And are they all these broken prophecies? Are they all prophecies that failed to come to pass?
They are.
Okay.
Because it's not. These were not just promises; they were promises with a time limit. The Greek word milo. Some of these words have been described as meaning on the verge of happening. One theologian said, picture a car teetering on a cliff about to fall off. That's how soon the second coming was expected to take place. 1 Corinthians, I believe, chapter 11 or 12, somewhere in there. Paul expects the second coming to happen within a few years at the latest, because he tells the Corinthians, don't get married. Do not get married. Of course, a few verses later, it says, well, whatever, it's okay. But, contradictions exist in the Bible. But the fact that the early church was commanded by an apostle to not get married because the second coming was going to come, and your marriage is going to be dissolved anyway, so why bother?
But that goes against Mormon teaching.
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
But marriages have become a major business moneymaker for churches nowadays. How many churches do you find telling their members don't get married because Jesus is due back any minute now? For some reason, that part of the Bible is completely ignored.
I have to share another anecdote. One of my earliest memories was like a fleeting glimpse from like maybe 2 or 3 years old, playing with a bunch of kids in this old house. And my family tells me that was a Jehovah's Witnesses or some similar sort of extreme Christian cult, and that they had a whole bunch of kids. They had like 8 kids. That was the only lucid thing I can remember. It was in one tiny house with just a whole bunch of kids. And they said, well, yeah, they were procreating. They were just cranking out babies every single year. But at the same time, they wouldn't wash their windows or mow their lawn because Jesus is coming back real soon.
There you go. Why bother? I mean, to me, it's like if you're on the Titanic and you think it's sinking, you're not going to rearrange the deck chairs. It'd be a complete waste of time.
Yeah, again, they won't mow their lawn because Jesus is coming back, and this was 1964.
I should have used that excuse when I was a kid. I mean, I can't mow the lawn. Jesus might come back. Another piece of evidence or line of evidence that can be used to establish the falseness of the second coming promises. I call it interim ethics, or in my book, the chapter is Ethics for La La Land. And these are ethics that were laid down in the New Testament that only make sense if the end of the world is going to happen within a few years. Otherwise, it's going to wreck your life. Things like when Jesus said, give anything to anybody if they ask you for it. How many Christians practice that now? But if you're on the Titanic and it's sinking, sure, here's my wallet. What's the big deal? Take it. Here's the deed to my house. Jesus said, if anybody asks you, give to him who asks. Another thing Jesus said was basically don't save up any money. You know, the birds don't save up. You know, they don't worry about tomorrow. Why are you worrying about tomorrow? Again, the early church maybe practiced these kind of things because they believed Jesus was coming. The modern church completely ignores these.
Well, they do the exact opposite.
Yes, they do.
I mean, there's a hilarious video called GOP Jesus, where it starts with the phrases Jesus, is alleged to have said, and then it turns to the right wing Fox News spin on that. Whoever brings a child unto me might be letting in a vagrant or a drug dealer. Let's get this kid into an isolation center till we can figure out what to do with them. That sort of thing. A lot of funny quips like that, but I mean, the modern Christian church is exactly opposite.
Exactly opposite.
I mean,
they
Jesus
realized
was renunciate. He was socialist. He advocated paying taxes.
Yeah. Another. I'll leave it at this. Another one that Jesus said that makes sense if your Titanic is sinking. Don't plan ahead. Don't plan for the future. Don't worry about the future. If you're on the Titanic, it's sinking. Hey, don't worry about tomorrow, just, today. But how many Christians are willing to give up their retirement plans? How many Christians are willing to throw away their day planner, their goals in life, their dreams in life? That's what Jesus commanded. And Christians nowadays, by their actions, back up the thesis of my book that basically these prophecies of the second coming were bunk. They're not happening. If they were happening on the time schedule Jesus gave, these Christians would be broke. They would have no retirement. They wouldn't mow the lawn.
One of my favorite comments about Jesus is when he says that he doesn't know when he's coming back, and he says that he hopes he hopes it won't be in winter. And that makes me think, Jesus, are you aware that you're supposed to be addressing the entire world, and are you aware that it's a sphere? And that when it's winter in Judea, it's summer in Australia. Do you even know there's an Australia?
That's a good point. Let me answer the quibble to that, because that is one of the quibbles that Christians bring up. But Jesus said he didn't know the day or hour. He did know the generation in which he would return, though, and he specified it repeatedly. So just because he didn't give the exact day, hour, minute, second, millisecond, don't ignore the fact that he said within that generation alive in 33 AD. So that was another good point. Another thing I devote a chapter to is I call it, if anybody else but Jesus. And it gets into when the JWs, the Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Mormons make prophecies. Christian fundamentalists will eat them alive, showing, this is what the prophecy said. It had a time limit and it expired, blah, blah, blah. Joseph Smith, back in the 1800s, made several prophecies that used some of Jesus's prophetic words in the New Testament. And there was this website by Ed Decker that tore Joseph a new a-hole for, he's a false prophet. This never happened within the 1800s, blah, blah, blah. Never realizing that at the same time, he was also condemning Jesus, because apparently Ed Decker didn't recognize that this was the same verbiage that Jesus had been using. So and the Jehovah's Witnesses predicted the second coming of Christ would happen in 1925, 1975, et cetera, et cetera. Fundamentalists get all over them for that, ignoring all the prophecies in the New Testament that Jesus himself made that didn't turn out.
I remember Pat Robertson in 1978 or 79. Pat Robertson said that there was going to be a great alignment of planets, and this planetary alignment was going to cause gravitational forces on either side of the Earth to tear the Earth in half, and that the Earth would be split in half by these gravitational forces in the year 1982.
We're dead.
Yeah, well, it's just like the sad thing about a lot of these prophecies is they just ignore that they ever said that.
Yeah.
So they say it to their 30,000 some odd followers, and then the next day, everybody forgets.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my mother, Mormon, right? She told me about the Mormon prophecy that the prophet said that there would never be a Mormon president, never. And then Mitt Romney runs for office, and she's voting for him. And I have to remind her, why are you voting for this guy? You know he's not going to win, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she doesn't remember the prophecy she told me about.
Mm. I know. Well, I'm waiting for the video that's going to go into all of the fundamentalist Christian prophets who predicted Trump was going to win the last election. There's got to be dozens.
Yeah, my Mormon family's still not accepting that he's not president. Mm-hmm. And it's like they keep pushing the expiration date back, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, I got somebody in my family to agree that by September 1st, if Trump is still in Mar-a-Lago and Biden, and everybody still says Biden is the president, then will you finally accept that you're watching stupid news that is just lying to you all day, every day? All you ever listen to is lies. If it has a grain of truth in it, you don't even want to know what it is. You only believe stupidity. So just admit to me you were wrong about that, which means your news sources were wrong about that. And if they're wrong about that, how much else are they wrong about? Right? So I got a written document signed by that person. If on September 1st, they would admit, oh no, come September 1st. And now we've pushed it back to mid-November.
But
then we'll find out that Trump was really secretly president all this time.
But September 1st of what year? Aha. Let me bring up something from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a favorite of Christians. They love his work. There's a certain book he wrote called World's Last Night that most of the Christians don't seem to read for some strange reason. I don't know why. But let me read just a quick little quote he has in here. And in the book, he's supposedly quoting an atheist. But he gives this quote from the atheist. He never refutes it, which to me means he lets it stand. He agrees with it. He's talking about the second coming. And it said, say what you like, we shall be told. The apocalyptic beliefs of the first Christians have been proved to be false. It is clear from the New Testament they all expected the second coming in their own lifetime. And worse still, they had a reason, and one which you will find very embarrassing. Their master had told them so. He shared and indeed created their delusion. He said in so many words, this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. Matthew 24:34. and he was wrong. It is certainly the most embarrassing verse in the Bible, and he goes on from there. But that is C.S. Lewis, one of Christianity's most darling theologians, admitting that Jesus screwed up on this. And his explanation, Jesus was part man, part God. That was the man part screwing up. What do you expect from a human? But at least he admitted that Jesus screwed up. So good for him.
I get a similar kind of thing from Christians when I point out that Jesus was wrong about what was the smallest seed. He was wrong because other farmers in his day, in his location, already knew of 2 or 3 that are smaller. He didn't know about the seasons of dates. So there's a handful of things that Jesus didn't know. I mean, one of my favorite lines out of that is when he goes against the common Jewish tradition that Christians will praise that God is so wise. He taught people to wash their hands, but they completely ignore that Jesus said, "Don't wash your hands," because if Jesus makes the argument that it doesn't matter what you take into your mouth, because Jesus believed that diseases were caused by demons and that demons were summoned by magic words. And so he thought that whatever comes out of your mouth is what corrupts you, not what goes in, as if there's no such thing as drugs or nutrients or intoxicants or pathogens. None of that. Jesus seems to be completely oblivious to this. He thinks the world is flat. He thought Moses was real. He thought that there was really a global flood. I mean, Jesus, and he doesn't know about intoxicants and so forth. I mean, so the guy this is not a guy to get medical advice from. And he admits that the people in his own hometown have no respect for him because they know him. So he's not able to pull his shtick there, because he's complaining that the people in his own hometown say, "Hey, aren't you that kid that grew?" And it's just like any modern faith healer, right? I mean, it's all a game. It's like even the point where Jesus is trying to bring back somebody's vision and then fails, I mean, so yeah, he's a faith healer. That's it. That's all. He's a faith healer in the 1st century, but he's just as much a scammer. That's why he's telling everybody to give up everything and give it all to Jesus, and he'll give it to the poor. And how many televangelists have we heard give it that exact thing? I mean, there was one here in Dallas where I lived, Bobby Tilton, who was taking in millions of dollars for this orphanage he runs in Haiti. And what a surprise. There is no such orphanage. Never was. But that's what you expect from faith healers. So I don't want to go on my own rant. I would like to hear from you, though. What is give me another couple of promises that Jesus made that are in your book. I'm very keen to read it. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to squeeze in the time. I'm wishing that I had, and I would invite people who have read it to throw some things into the comments.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Another point. It's not Jesus. It's supposedly his apostle Peter. But Peter, I believe, was telling the congregation he was writing to that you guys are having disputes amongst each other. Whatever. So maybe somebody's dog pissed on another person's lawn and they wanted to take it to court. Whatever. They had some legal disputes among the Christians themselves. And I believe it was Peter, could have been James, but he says, basically, Jesus is coming back so soon. Don't even bother taking this before the magistrate. The judge of all the universe is going to come down, and he can basically adjudicate, this dog pissing on the lawn thing, whatever. Again, it makes no sense at all if Jesus was actually not due for another 2,000 years. I have to mention, if we're getting low on time, I do have to mention something called Preterism. Have you had the misfortune of hearing that before?
It sounds like another word I was thinking of, but no, I don't think I've heard that one.
Okay. Preterism is one of the excuses that Christians have come up with to get around all these false prophecies of Jesus. And like any Christian movement, of course, it's already splintered into a dozen other smaller movements. The unity of the brethren always amazes me. But the basic theory behind preterism is that they do admit these verses in the New Testament limited the second coming to the 1st century. They're honest in that amount. But what they say was Jesus did return, but he returned invisibly. Nobody saw him. I'm serious. This is a real theory.
Okay, so but this is the same book that when Jesus died, right, and they say that they saw him after he died, they saw him alive, but his own mother couldn't recognize him. None of them could.
Coincidence.
Yeah, so they're looking at this guy who doesn't look like the guy they know, but they identify it as Jesus anyway.
Bingo.
Right. So, the hell is that about? So this is just the kind of excuses that people make up to save their prophecies. I was thinking about another example with the recent Trump thing, where people won't accept that Trump isn't president anymore. You know, they keep pushing things back. It was right in my mind. I sidetracked. I lost it. Must be getting old.
Nonsense.
I'm trying to remember what when Jesus, they didn't really see Jesus alive, but they say that they saw him alive, and I remember what it was. In 2001, May 22nd, 2001. No, May 21st of 2001. Harold Camping said that the world was going to tear itself out. You know, a lot like
I remember
a lot like a bunch of other evangelicals have done for various years over the last couple centuries. And he says that the world's going to end at 6 p.m. Eastern time, because of course that's the way prophecies work, at 6 p.m. right? So
Eastern time.
Yeah. So the world is going to split in half. Well, it's better than when the world was created at 9 a.m. according to some guy who lived in Central Europe. So 9 a.m. Okay. Well, anyway, I don't even know how they worked that out. But anyway, Harold Camping says that the world was going to end at this time. Now, I thought it alarming that Camping was also that they leaked his business planner, and he was still scheduling appointments for after the world ends. And then when the world didn't end, he made the exact excuse that you just brought up, that it really did end. It just ended invisibly. We didn't notice that the world had ended.
There you go. Invisible Jesus. I think the I think the J-Dubs used that one for a while too. I don't know if they still use it. That he really did return to 25, but he was invisible.
Or he was somebody else, and they're all saying, "Hey, you're my Jesus." And
I have another book that I've been working on the resurrection, and that point you brought up about even his own mother didn't recognize him, and the two apostles that he hung out with for several years, walking side by side for mile after mile, did not recognize his gait, his accent, his manner of speech, how he looked. It's incomprehensible. I want to share in a little bit of an email I got from somebody who had read my book. Just one. I'm not going to give his name because I don't want any hate people bothering him. But this is part of what he emailed me. I watched you on the Myth Vision podcast, which is how I heard about your book. Just hearing the words, Jesus was a false prophet, noticing the sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and knowing that old indoctrination was at fault, I about started sobbing. I have since left the Catholic Church and reject religion entirely. One of the things I'm hoping this book accomplishes, this idea of Jesus being a false prophet, to me, is a make or break issue. This is something that is foundational to all of Christianity. It's hard to remain a Christian if you believe Jesus was a liar and a false prophet. You can remain a Christian. I know your specialty is evolution. You can be a super fundy Christian and reject evolution, and then you persuade him to believe in evolution, and he can just switch over to being a theistic evolutionist and get to sleep that night. There are some issues that they can squiggle around. This is one issue where they'd have to be super, super liberal Christian out in left field to still accept Jesus, even after acknowledging, okay, he was a liar and a charlatan and 100 other bad things.
A Christian once told me that I can't criticize Jesus for not knowing this or that or the other thing that people didn't know in the first century that Jesus was clearly wrong about, because, and this, I love that this is a Christian saying this, because he was only human.
That's the human half. That's the C.S. Lewis cop out. That's his human half. Let me just go over a few miscellaneous verses from the New Testament. Again, there are probably hundreds of verses. These are just a few gems that indicate time is running short. And again, we're talking first century, 2,000 years ago. Acts 2:15, for it shall be in the last days that I shall pour forth my spirit upon all flesh. Okay, so the day of Pentecost thing in 2nd chapter of Acts was in the last days. Hebrews 1, verse 1, God in these last days, 1 Peter 1:20, has plainly manifested himself in these last days. James 5:3, it is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. So, side note, James in the 5th chapter is writing to the rich people that you have saved up all your wealth, but it's in the last days. Okay, so let's say these rich people had bank accounts, et cetera, and it was in the last days that James is saying they've saved up these bank accounts. These banks aren't even in existence anymore, much less the accounts, much less their wealth. This was all due. The second coming was due while these rich people had their money, while these rich people were still alive, not 2,000 years afterwards. Revelation 3:10, the hour of testing that is about to come. And that's one of those Greek words that I define in the front of the book. Revelation 22:6, the things which must shortly take place. Revelation 22:10, the time is near. I am coming quickly. And then one of my favorites is 1 John 2:18. And I'm going to see if I can get this in the camera. Children, it is the last hour. Again, obviously, 2,000 years later, that was a blatant lie, a falsehood. I mean, we're not even talking years or generation or days. We're talking hours.
So the apologetic that I hear for that is from people who think that the earth only existed for 2,000 years before Jesus, not four. They say it only existed for 2,000 years, and that puts, and so there's everything after the pinnacle when he shows up is the second half, and anything in the second half is the last days, the last week, the last hour.
Yeah, convoluted.
Of course, there's just so much they have to ignore to say that. But I mean,
oh yeah.
So I have one other question for you. Do you include in Jesus's promises things like that were not in the four canonical gospels, or that are like, I think it's in Timothy, where Timothy is now telling us what Jesus says or what Jesus is going to do, and then Jesus has a bloody wine press, for example, and he's going to come back and he's going to take all the unbelievers and he's going to kill all the unbelievers in a bloody wine press so that we're all up to our knees in blood. Am I remembering that right?
That's not ringing a bell offhand.
Okay.
I have included, I believe, every single verse in the New Testament that deals with the second coming, that Christians themselves would agree this has to do with the second coming. There's some verses, like in Corinthians, when Paul talks about, I believe it's the 13th chapter, it's in dispute whether the perfect in that chapter is talking about the second coming or the completion of the Bible or whatever. I don't include that because Christians themselves don't agree that's the second coming passage.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I do genuinely lament that I couldn't squeeze the time in to read this because it sounds good. And as I said, I invite anybody watching to put your comments in the comment section about that if you've read it. And I'm going to let you make a closing statement. I've already put the Amazon link in the description.
All right. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Close it out.
I do recommend that you buy this book and keep it as a reference, because sure enough, I guarantee within our lifetime still, there will be 2 or 3 Christian movements that are going to promise the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus. That's a topic that's never out of style among Christians. For any Christians watching this video, I challenge you, if your Jesus is a true prophet of God, you've got nothing to fear from this book. What are you waiting for? Go ahead and check it out. To any non-Christians or ex-Christians watching this book, there is source material in here that you absolutely have to deal with your religious cousins, brothers, parents, etc., that have threatened you with the second coming of Jesus. And we've all been there. Again, it's not really a book you sit down and read at bedtime, but there's a hell of a lot of good content. My bibliography goes over 250 sources. Every single thing in here is referenced, page number, book, publisher, etc. You want to check it out. If you want to confirm that I'm quoting correctly, it's all there for you to check out. So thank you. And it's been good talking to you.
Thank you very much. This is a perfect place to close out.
Okay. Bye-bye.